Hello, I am Kevin Williamson, a writer in residence with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and this is How the World Works, where we have conversations about work and the work that we do and the work that we have done in the past and what it means other than a paycheck and what we learned from it and things related to that and what work means in society. I have here with me an old friend who's had a lot of interesting jobs. This is Nick Gillespie, who is best known to a lot of you as having been the editor of Reason Magazine, a position he now holds in an emeritus capacity, I believe, if I'm correct.
I'm an editor at large.
Editor at large. How at large are you? Do you range?
I've been keeping it tight. So, I actually weigh less than I did when I was editor in chief. So,
okay. Yeah. Well, I'm afraid I can't say the same. But Nick has had a bunch of interesting jobs. We're going to talk about Teen Beat and Corey Haim and all sorts of stuff. But can we start with pantyliners?
Yeah, sure. So, I was raised lower middle class, I guess you would say, not quite working class, because my parents, who were both poor growing up, they were the children of immigrants. My father managed to sneak into the lowest level of white collar work. He was an office manager. So I grew up thinking of myself as middle class until I kind of got to college, and I was the first generation of my family to go to college.
So you were born in New York, but grew up where?
I was born in New York. I was born in Brooklyn, but I grew up in New Jersey.
New Jersey, okay.
Yeah, and I went to Rutgers, which leads to the pantyliner story. I was not only the first generation of my family to go to college, I also paid for it completely myself, which meant working a lot. And I went to Rutgers in New Jersey, which is in New Brunswick, which is also home to Johnson & Johnson, including Johnson & Johnson personal products. And they have a lot of factories. It's light industrial work, but I worked in a pantyliner factory for a while. This was actually shortly after I graduated from college. And it was kind of fascinating. It's like a Willy Wonka world, but for personal hygiene. And I sometimes think back to these jobs and I don't quite know how to explain them, because I was working through a temp agency, and I got, I would do 40 hours of work there, but there were different jobs within the factory where they create panty liners for women, which are actually made out of pulped paper that is then treated with something that was actually called super absorbent. And there were these 56-gallon drums of super absorbent all over the factory that had like skulls and crossbones on them and saying like, danger, do not touch, do not put your hand in there. And of course, the minute somebody says like, whatever you do, don't touch this, my impulse is to at least put a tip of a finger in there. But the paper would be treated with this stuff, which can then absorb massive amounts of liquid.
Still super absorbent. Yeah. What do you clean it up with?
Maybe you don't have to, or the oxygen itself gets pulled out of the air, and it's, that's the beginning of the end of the world. But there was so much gunk all over the factory because the paper gets pulped into something super fine, and it just gums up all of the works of the machines. And one of the main jobs I had was cleaning all of the intricate, assembly line parts where you would scrub it with various kinds of brushes, and you would have to kind of put your fingers in places you couldn't see and hope that the line didn't start again or anything like that, and just wiggle until everything was clean. And again, I realized like I'm hallucinating thinking about this, and I apologize if none of this makes any sense, if I sound like Kamala Harris, talking about public policy right now. There was a vent where they caught a lot of the paper pulp that was, just kind of ambient, would get trapped in these filters that was above a big room. And it would be packed into these cotton tubes that were like tree trunks. You could barely, when they were full, you could barely get your arms around them, but they would get clogged up. And one of my jobs was to go into this filter room, and it was like something out of a Stanley Kubrick movie or like a demented Willy Wonka movie, where all of the paper pulp would be packed into these tubes and you had to loosen it up by hitting it and shaking it and punching them. And it was, 110 degrees. You had to wear hazmat suits and goggles, and I would be sweating immediately in them. And like you would just start and move one by one through this forest of tubes, cleaning them out so that all of the paper pulp fell into a floor beneath it, where then I would have to go down and there would be, I don't know, a foot deep of paper pulp that I would have to sweep up, which was then super hard to do because the minute you touched it with a broom, it would puff up like, talcum powder or something. And it was just, it made me think of, that Camus Sisyphus had it easy. It was just an insane job where, and I would, after a shift, I would be like 4 pounds lighter, probably 4 to 5,000% angrier. And part of what that taught me was, that I really wanted to do something other than be a laborer, as much as anything.
So when people ask you what you do with an English degree from Rutgers, there's
yeah. Well, actually, my very bad. This is a good thing with being in New Jersey, one of at that point 2 states. I think it's the only state now that mandates that gas. You can't pump your own gas because it is a safety risk, right? Because, the newspapers every day, once after page 1, it's just endless stories of people blowing themselves up, pumping their gas in 49 states. But my first job out of college, actually, as an English major, I graduated with high honors and a bunch of other awards. I worked an overnight shift at a gas station, a Sunoco station just off the Garden State Parkway. Pumping gas and doing brake jobs and replacing tires and things like that, which also, was a helpful reminder that like, hey, you know what? My parents were just happy I went to college. And, so I could have, like, as far as they were concerned, that's like all, the fact that I graduated in 4 years, that was pretty good. Working these kinds of jobs made me think like, okay, maybe I can use that degree to kind of elevate up to a higher level of income and less physical work.
Yeah, I'm picturing young Nick Gillespie angrily punching big tubes of paper pulp.
The memory is, it's like degrades in my head every time I think about it because it's so otherworldly. And when I was in high school, my parents, for bizarre reasons that I think are actually very much related to them being, they were kind of posers in the middle class. They had grown up extremely poor during the Depression to immigrant families. My father was in New York City and my mother was in Waterbury, Connecticut. They wanted to present in a certain way. And one of the odd forms that took was they insisted in my hometown, which had excellent public schools, they insisted that my siblings and I go to the incredibly mediocre parochial Catholic school. So that was a reach for them. And I ended up paying for my last year of high school. I went to Modern Day High School, Mother of God, which went out of business recently. It was just a terrible school. But I had to work. And one of the jobs I had when I was in high school was another light factory job, like an assembly job where I was putting together electric circuit boards for electric staplers. And it was, this mom and pop factory in a kind of town that was adjacent to my hometown. And we would spend hours putting together, it would be a strip of circuit boards and there were different transistors and diodes and whatever in that. And you would have to put them together in a certain order and then feed it through a strip solder machine, which when it was like very low rent, so it was constantly hissing and bubbling and giving off sparks. You would have to trim the back of the circuit board down so that the transistor things weren't protruding too far, which would then, when you used a particular type of saw, which when it cut through the metal, they would fly off very hot from the contact and like sting your arms. And again,
wearing the hazmat suit, which reminds me of one of my sort of humble jobs I had when I was in high school. I worked at Burger King.
Yeah.
And, you tell people you worked at Burger King, they're expecting stories about food being gross and that kind of stuff, which it really wasn't. It was surprisingly hygienic, and considering the quality of people they employed, meaning me and people like me, prepared in a surprisingly responsible manner most of the time.
Right.
And I worked a sort of late shift across the street from this gigantic cowboy dance bar. And so the people coming in at 3 o'clock in the morning were not happy usually because they'd gone there hoping, sort of to go home with someone maybe. And they
said they're going home with a Whopper, right?
Yeah, that's not the happiest cowboys in Texas at that time. One of them asked me, he came to the front of the line and looked at the menu and asked me what I recommended. And I told him Alcoholics Anonymous. But I did have to wear a hazmat suit because one of my jobs was, and we were only closed for like 2.5 hours a night or something like that. We closed at like 3:30 and reopened at 5, or that's only an hour and a half. So we were closed for a very short period of time. And my job was to clean the flame broiler, among the jobs that I had. And you see the Burger King commercials, and they talk about flame broiled burgers, and it's like this big grill thing, right? Like you're barbecuing in the backyard. It's not that at all, of course. It's this thing that runs off a conveyor belt.
Yeah.
And and it runs all day, and it gets pretty greasy. The one scary thing about the food there was how meat from the USDA comes graded, like it's grade A, grade B, whatever. The meat we had was marked fit for human consumption, and which I sort of thought was great. But the flame broiler wasn't really all that gross, except for the fact that it had been cooking burgers all day. But there was some regulation somewhere, I assume it's a federal regulation, that says you have to wear this ridiculous hazmat suit when you clean it. And so I did. I'm not sure anyone ever cleaned the hazmat suit, but I did wear it when I broke down the flame broiler. Not the worst job I ever had in my life, not by a long shot. It was actually a pretty fun job for the most part. And it paid me surprisingly well. The first article I ever wrote for National Review was an article I wrote on Labor Day. It's a freelance piece before I was working there. And it was about how I'd never made minimum wage, which I hadn't, still haven't. Hope I still be able to say that.
I hope you dodged that bullet.
But, Burger King, like a lot of places like that, I worked at 7-Eleven.
Yeah.
If you seem like you're going to be a halfway responsible, non-meth using person, you can actually command a much higher wage. But I spent part of that summer building those playscapes they used to have out around Burger Kings and McDonald's. I guess they still do. And I thought I was rich because they kept me on the clock for my regular shift and then paid me $10 an hour in cash to do construction outdoors in Lubbock.
That's wonderful.
Summer, which was nice because Lubbock's a desert, so it's pleasant in the summers. It's hot, but it's dry, and it's sort of nice. So got a good tan. It wasn't the worst job I ever had. When people ask me about the worst jobs I ever had, telemarketing, I think, was really the worst job. The one I just couldn't do. I couldn't bring myself to do. I had it for maybe 6 weeks or something.
Was it the people hanging up immediately or screaming at you, or what was it?
It was, it was just neither one of those things really. Like the people who would like scream at you, I sort of understood. I've been it's annoying too. So I would work these, 8-hour shifts. And so okay, a little background first. So I wasn't selling anything. I was doing market research for, they didn't tell us this, but clearly for Alfa Romeo. So this is the 1980s or so. And Alfa Romeo has not sold a car in the United States by that point in 30 years. They got out of the market in 20 years, probably, I guess, the late 60s, they got out of the market. And they were thinking about re-entering the US market. So they gave us this long survey to do over the phone. And it took like an hour and 15 minutes to do the survey.
Yeah.
So who wants to talk to you about a car that hasn't been sold in the United States in 25 years for an hour and a half? Crazy people, car freaks, and shut-ins. So I'm not sure what kind of value this really produced for them, although they did eventually reintroduce Alfa into the US market, although it was a long time. And but the questions were all, so now I'm going to ask you randomly about Alfa Romeo. And randomly 50 times, like even the people you're asking the questions from kind of get it. That was the people I worked with were nice and they were fine. I had a good friend who's still a good friend of mine who was sort of devious sort of guy, and he would call people up and he would do this like weepy thing where he would tell them that he was going to lose his job if they didn't complete a survey. And so he'd get like 19 done a night or something. And
did you only get credit for ones that went all the way through?
Well, you got paid by the hour, but you had like a quota of how many you had to get done. And I think you got bonuses if you got more than your quota done. He didn't really get 19 done a night, but he would get like one done an hour. and or every hour and a half. It was pretty impressive. He, needless to say, is far wealthier than I am these days, and has been very successful in life doing things that
Well,
I'm.
the reason why the pantyliner job was so attractive to me was that it paid at the time. This would have been in the mid '80s, and minimum wage was maybe 3.85 or 4.25, and this paid something like $8 an hour.
Yeah,
And it came with they gave you two sets of coveralls.
nice.
So it was like, okay, that's pretty exciting. I could walk around in my off hours like I was in Devo or something like that. So that was, those were the things that motivated me. I also had similar jobs like that where I worked at UPS for a while, and that was the dream job of if you could get 20 hours a week at a UPS place, like emptying trucks out and things like that. That would
So
be.
you were a member of the labor union when you were.
Well, no, I wasn't, because this was the training program. And what they would do is they would keep you around for maybe a month and then say, okay, we can't use you anymore. And that would break your streak. So you didn't, I think if you worked like 30 or 45 or 60 days continuously, then you could join the union. So they kept stopping you right before that. And I had, for a while I did that, and I worked from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. And that is brutal. And I think that's one of the things that, when you are working nighttime or weird shift hours, and especially if you are getting out of work as the sun is coming up, that does a real, number on you. And that was, I stopped, I ended up, and I would love to talk about my days being a teen magazine editor and a music magazine editor and things like that in a sec. But I had worked for a few years in New York, and I had gotten some journalism jobs. And then I went back to grad school, and I ended up in Buffalo working on my PhD. And I went for a kind of light factory job where we were, I guess, assembling computer memory tapes. This was back before, everything was on a flash drive or something like that. So, what was good about it is you could work, I think it was 4 10-hour shifts rather than work, 5 8-hour shifts for a full week. But it meant, or it might even have been like a 12-hour shift. And maybe I did 3 12-hour shifts, but you would go in at 7 p.m. and get out at 7 a.m. And there would be a dinner break at, I don't know, like 2:30 in the morning in this industrial park about 15 miles outside of Buffalo, where there was nothing, you couldn't drive anywhere, get food and come back in time. So there was a vending machine, or you would bring in, a cheese sandwich or something like that. And that was, it was loud and noisy and mindless. And at that point, and I needed the money, but I was like, okay, I got to figure out, how to use my brains rather than, it's not even really brawn, but, use physical labor to kind of make my way in the world.
So which part of this kind of low-paid work with exploitative labor practices and sometimes dangerous industrial conditions made you want to be a advocate for untrammeled capitalism?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, part of it, let me, my very first job was a paper boy. I'm 60, so I'm old enough to have lived in a world where paper boys still existed. And again, my parents, who grew up kind of rough, they were happy that I wanted to be a paper boy, because that shows like I'm not going to be a bum. And I have a lot of unemployed men in my family tree. They kind of dangle, they're the strange fruit of the Gillespie side and the Guida side. And that's always a fear. But they were also very nervous that, they would tell me, like, never go into somebody's house. If anybody invites you in, leave immediately and call the police. They lived in a world that was, where everybody was Jeffrey Epstein, regardless of income level. And they were very fearful in that way. But
so they were like 21st century parents ahead of their time.
That pretty much, yeah, on that. And, and I think a lot of it had to do with growing up in the Depression, when there were just like scads of unemployed men hanging around all the time during the day. And, that oftentimes leads to trouble.
Yeah.
But I worked for my hometown library. I managed to get a job as a page, somebody who puts books away. And I went in for my first shift, and the librarians there, the guy who ran it was a man, but all of the librarians were women. And they gave me this cart of books that probably had, 100 or 150 books on it, and said, okay, and they were like, this is complicated, so pay attention. It's like fiction books are out, they're put away alphabetically by the name of the author, the last name of the author. And then the Dewey Decimal System, you just follow the numbers and slot it in. And they were like, okay, so like, do you understand that? And I was in high school and I was, not mentally retarded. So I was like, okay, I got that pretty quickly. And they were like, okay, don't, this might take you a while. So whatever. So I had a 4-hour shift. I returned these books to their proper place on the shelves in about 15 minutes. And I came back and they were like, what are you doing here, to the main desk? And I was like, well, I put the books away. Do you want me to do something else? And one of them pulled me into an office and said, like, don't you ever do that again. We told you to take the whole shift to do that. And they were so mad. Like, it was the laziest workforce I'd ever seen. And I think that may have started me on the road to wanting to reduce the size, scope, and spending of the state at every level, because there seems to be a lot of waste there. Even as I loved the public library, it was a real oasis of my life.
Yeah, mine too, growing up.
Yeah.
You
and,
were,
and to be a little bit more serious about, the more physical labor type stuff, I'd say, why I'm a capitalist, not, I'm a capitalist because I think that capitalism gives more people more opportunities to move up. And I, in a way, I don't even want to say move up, but to express themselves, to find places in the world that work for them and that give them money or meaning or free time or whatever. And I realized my parents, it's a very typical story. All of my grandparents came over from Ireland and Italy. They did okay, but not particularly well, but they did a lot better than they would have if they had stayed in either Ireland or Italy. My parents ended up doing pretty well. They were uneducated. My father didn't graduate high school. My mother was a bookkeeper who struggled to do like basic math functions. I mean, she was not, neither of them were very good workers, but they were hard workers. And they were like, we did better than our parents and you're going to do better than us. And I took that seriously. And I do think, that generally, that things like free enterprise capitalism, a limited, a world in which people have more opportunities to create the businesses they want, to live how they want, et cetera, is better. And so what these hard labor jobs or these, kind of blue collar type jobs that I worked at a bit were a reminder to me both of what was out there and what I wanted to do, which was a little bit better. But I also saw most of the people around me, doing well, and they either expressed themselves, if they were lucky, I guess they expressed themselves through doing the type of work that they wanted to do because it meant something to them, or it gave them the money and the time then, on the weekends or after work to indulge themselves in ways that they wanted to. So,
so you and I talking about rock music journalism in the 1980s is going to be like some peak Gen X libertarian pain in the ass conversation. But let's go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
Tell me about music journalism and Teen Beat and that stuff.
Yeah, so I ended up, the first kind of jobs I got, this was a benefit of growing up in the New York area. And I had always been oriented to New York. I knew I wanted to live and work in New York City after I graduated. And I had family there. I was very familiar with it. And, the 70s and the early 80s were not great times for New York, but they were better than suburban New Jersey, really. And I did not really think that there was any other part of the world that, like I didn't have any idea of lighting out for the territory or anything like that. But I got a bunch of jobs through the New York Times. They had classified ads, and I worked for a business publication company for a while, and I really didn't like it. And I would work and save up money and then go travel. I had a beat up old car that I would drive around the country, sometimes with friends, sometimes by myself. And in any case, I ended up through a couple of cycles of that. I worked for the American edition of Smash Hits, which was a British pop and new wave magazine, and we were independent of them. but it was very similar. And that was, amazingly fun. I got to, I got to write about rock, like new wave and post punk. This was really type of stuff like that, which was a lot of fun. They had, I worked for a company that, this one company that published smash hits, which was headed by the guy who went on to create Blender magazine and Maxim and The Week, Felix Dennis, who is he died some years ago. But he was a publishing legend, particularly in the UK. He had been part of an underground magazine called Oz, which got censored by the government. And he and his co-editors were actually threatened with some kind of trumped up porn charge in England. John Lennon cut a benefit single for them. He was a super commie, but he then, after all of that, he became an early publisher of Kung Fu magazines and became a millionaire. And he also he created a couple of magazines about Macintosh computers, really ahead of the curve. And this, so it was kind of exciting working for him. We also published a magazine called Metal Licks, like it looked like Metallics, IX, but Metal Licks. It'll rock you to shreds. And, so I got to, through the course of that, I interviewed everybody from Ozzy Osbourne to some of the people in New Order to Slash of Guns N' Roses, like a real time capsule of anything from about 86 to 88.
Who's your most fun musical interview?
What's that?
Who was your most fun musical interview? The most
it was probably, well, there are two broad categories, but one was we would often, because we were a lesser magazine and nobody, we didn't really have much clout. Like we would talk to a lot of new bands, and there were a lot of like new romantic bands coming out of England. And I remember one was called Shelley and Orphan, right?
I remember them, yeah.
But like they all said the same thing. They were like, we are going to revolutionize popular music. It will not look the same after, our album is released. And then you would basically never hear from them again. And I kind of enjoyed that, because it's like, yeah, they're Promethean. They are like Shelley, they're going to change the world. And there were a ton of people like that. And then there was also a more American version, particularly people who were more into rock or heavy metal, where they would always talk about how their high school years had been terrible, but now they're the star and fuck you. And then they would disappear. But I interviewed Ozzy Osbourne when he released I think it was a live album, but it was after Randy Rhoads, his guitarist, died in like the most idiotic heavy metal disaster ever, where him and another guy were buzzing the tour bus in like a crop dusting plane and ran into a bunch of electrical wires and killed themselves. And this was very much Ozzy Osbourne was he had just gotten sober momentarily, so he was very apologetic because he was deep in getting clean. So he was always apologizing for having been who he had been for the past 15 or 20 years. He talked a lot about how Randy Rhoads is a genius and a god in Japan and things like that. And we always used to ask a series of questions to every rock star, because then you would compile them into vast lists of things that these kinds of magazines would do. And one of the last question in any interview we did was always, do you have a message to your fans? And Ozzy Osbourne said, like, yes, get down, rock and roll. And I was just like, what does that mean? And he just repeated, like, get down, rock and roll. And I was like, okay. But what was interesting about him is that he was actually a very nice person, and this is like, when, he was at his bat eating scariest. And, he talked about how much he loved the Beatles. And he had met Jonathan Richman, not Jonathan Richman of the Modern Lovers, but the old guy who had written the kind of 60s pop tune, Everybody's Gone to the Moon, which is like a very twee kind of hippie song. And I remember part of me was disappointed that Ozzy was not actually a Satanist or horrifying or scary, that he was like a sweet, lovable guy in a profound way, which, I guess turned out to be who he really is.
Yeah. Just thinking of my I haven't done a lot of that kind of writing, but music interviews, probably the most interesting person I interviewed as an interviewer was Henry Rollins, who
Like,
also is not kind of what you expect him to be. He's
yeah.
a very, sort of gentlemanly guy. But I remember an interview I didn't do that also kind of stands out in my head. I was working at the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, and Lisa Loeb was playing in
Oh,
Lubbock.
yeah, yeah,
Lisa Loeb. And so I figured I would just try to interview people who were, coming to town to
yeah.
do shows. And so I called or maybe emailed her people and said I wanted to do a quick interview, 15 minutes, you're in or out. And they gave me this really snooty reply about, us not being a big enough, newspaper to really be worth her time. I'm like, dude, she's playing in Lubbock, right?
Yeah,
Like at the
I know.
fairgrounds.
Well, you must have gotten to everybody, right? I mean, because a ton of people go through Lubbock, right?
Well,
So,
a ton of people from there. Yeah.
yeah,
But
but I
also,
mean,
it's
on the
kind of,
concert trail, I'm assuming there's like a fairly good circuit.
oh, yeah. I mean, because there's nothing between Dallas and Albuquerque.
Yeah,
It's what's there. And this was not a story of mine, but my favorite sort of Lubbock music story. I remember New Kids on the Block did a show
sure.
in Lubbock.
Yeah.
And whoever the singer was, I can't remember, announced, the guitarist, they were introducing the guitarist and saying, and please welcome Lubbock's own, blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
whatever his name was. And our entertainment editor was perplexed by this. I never heard of this guy. Who is he? And of course, the next night he was Amarillo's own, and then it was
Oh,
Tulsa.
yeah.
And they would just make up every night that he was from the town he was from. So, which of the Coreys were crazier?
Yeah, I am. I'm proud of this. I feel like Philippe Petit with the the Twin Towers. Nobody can ever tightrope walk across the Twin Towers. Nobody else can interview the two Coreys ever again because one of them is no longer with us. And I interviewed
people who aren't 60. Explain, please.
Yeah, at various points, Corey Haim and Corey Feldman, who were big teen stars. Corey Haim was his first movie, I think, was Lucas, a winningly affectionate kind of teen high school movie. And Corey Feldman was in Stand By Me, the one of Rob Reiner's first movies, based on a Stephen King story that's very good. And then they were in a movie called The Lost Boys together, which was a vampire beach movie that had a bunch of people in it. And they became kind of real brats for a while in the kind of teen mag underworld. And each of them, and this is true of almost all of the teen stars I saw, and it's just an endless procession of of people, especially if they were under like 15 or 16 at the time, where they were almost always very snotty and mean. There was a lot going on in their lives, which was somebody like Corey Haim, who died following I don't know if it was an accidental or an intentional overdose a few years ago, and had suffered really disturbing sexual abuse, as had Corey Feldman, or Corey Feldman talks a lot about that as well. But they were kind of nasty people to be around, and they were always
they were kids at this point, though, right?
Yeah. I mean, and it was it was disturbing because the parent, typically the mother and a manager, would be around, and there was always some unspeakable tension going on among that. And, and then they all had delusions of grandeur, again, kind of like Shelley and Orphan, where one of the reasons I went back to grad school, which I, had never considered when I graduated college, but, after you are talking to people like Corey Haim and Corey Feldman and teen stars even further down the list who haven't even really made anything yet. And they always would end things by saying, but what I really want to do is direct. And it was like, okay, I got to get out of here. When, the co-star of License to Drive is saying, what I really need to do is direct movies, not merely star in them. It's time to start looking elsewhere.
You didn't like License to Drive?
Excuse me?
You didn't like License to Drive?
Not particularly, no. But it was always fun going to, this. I mean, I was young. I was in my early 20s and working in New York and going to premieres of movies like, License to Drive, or I got to go to the New York premiere of Stand By Me, which was interesting. And to see movies before they were coming out, like it's a very different ecosystem now, and in many ways, this was, the beginning of the end of the older star system, and you could start to understand why it was falling apart. But I love popular culture. I think popular culture is not simply something that we consume, but rather the relationship that people have to things like Hollywood and stars and big stories and things like that is a really important part of of American cultural identity. So it was fascinating to see that start to kind of to be in on that a little bit. One of the companies I worked for, which no longer exists, was called Sterling's Magazines. And there I worked for a magazine hilariously called Teen Machine. Teen Machine, which strikes me as like, a porno title if there ever was one. But among other, they also published Metal Edge, which was a pretty widely read metal magazine. And I did some stuff for them. And it's like when you get to interview Vinnie Vincent during the Vinnie Vincent invasion,
yes.
As it was happening, that's like being witness to history, right? They had a morgue because, a library or an archive. They were either the publisher, or they had inherited the rights to Modern Screen magazine. So they had this archive where I was always interested in old movies and things. And they had published a bunch of the original stories of Joan Crawford, like the fake stories of her having picnics with her adopted kids and things like that. And I would just pour through all of that. I remember looking at the file for Sue Lyon, who was Lolita in Stanley Kubrick's Lolita, and had been picked out of nowhere. And you could see, all of the clips about her becoming a starlet, and, Lolita was a big thing. And then she made a couple other movies. Her last big movie was Night of the Iguana, a John Huston film of a Tennessee Williams play. And then there was a moment where she married a Black man who was in prison. And then there was one shot of the honeymoon, or of where she's going in to a place for conjugal visits. And then the file ends. And it's like, wow, it was filled with weird stuff like that. Or I remember a lot of the people I worked with there were gay. And, and again, this is a different time in the 80s. And there was more of an appreciation of camp and irony. And we had this massive archive on Dick Chamberlain, on Richard Chamberlain, who was obviously gay, but nobody would talk about him being gay. And reading back through the 50s and 60s when he was in things like Dr. Kildare, and them talking about how this romance hadn't worked out with this starlet, and Mamie Van Doren appearances and everything. And it's fascinating, just to look at that. I realize that I'm a big fan of Andy Warhol and his sensibility. And it's partly because whatever else he did, he, like my parents, really, grew up poor in an immigrant community and was dazzled by stardom. And more than that, really, the idea that you could recreate yourself, that you could be nobody and then suddenly emerge into this other type of thing. And there's obviously some real truth and power to that, as well as an incredible dark side. And I think, we now live in a world where, it's morphed into something different, but it's endlessly fascinating to me.
Yeah. So that's the point at which work starts to pay some psychic dividends instead of just being a way to keep yourself from starving to death and being homeless. I remember this well. I know you know Philly a little bit because you went to Temple for a while, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the editor of the Mainline Times out in Lower Merion. And I remember this afternoon really so well that I sat down to pay my bills, which was I had rent and then maybe a utility bill. And I had one other thing. I don't think I had a car payment at that point. And I remember being able to sit down and pay them all without checking to make sure that I had enough money in the bank to cover the checks.
Yeah.
And that moment I thought, okay, I'm sort of officially not poor anymore.
Yeah.
I'm not buying a yacht or a Ferrari or anything like that, but I can start maybe thinking about some other things. Because and this is probably a career mistake for me in a lot of ways, but up till that point in my life, and I would have been in my late 20s by then, I had really made all of my major job decisions on just almost purely financial grounds. So when I was working in India for a while when I left college, and then I came back and I was working in the newspaper in Lubbock, and I was offered a job. I could work as an editor or as a reporter, whichever one I wanted to. And I chose the editor's job because it paid like 80 cents an hour more
Right.
than the reporting job did. And that was probably the wrong choice in retrospect, that I would have done more writing earlier in
If
life.
you had played your cards right, we wouldn't be talking to each other right now. Right? Yeah.
Yeah,
That is really fascinating. And this is something where my father had a real influence on me because, like I was saying, he was at the lowest level of white collar work. He worked for a shipping company called Sealand, which I think was bought by CSX. And it basically meant he did a ton of extra work. Like if he had been in the union, like he oversaw a bunch of guys, who were either in the longshoremen's union or something affiliated with that, he would have been making six figures with overtime and all kinds of, stuff like that. And instead he made, when I started working full time, God, I'm trying to think, when I was like maybe 23 or 24, the first time I had like a full career job, I was making more money than he was after 30 or years in the workforce. But he told me that, you have to play a longer game, and that at his company, they had done a thing where I guess I'm trying to remember now, but they had raised the entry level salary for the mailroom or something like that, which had been an executive training program, but they had raised it high enough where a lot of people went to it and then just stayed with that rather than kind of learning like how to move up in the business. And in a lot of industries, the starting salary of a job that has more of a future, or a track that has more of a future, pays less.
Yeah.
And there's weird reasons to that. When I first graduated college, I started looking at publishing jobs because I was so like, okay, you're an English major, you like to write, get into publishing. And I was always
nothing.
Yeah. And then I talked to a couple people, and I mean, this was, I graduated in 85, and I was offered a job at like Random House or something. And I was like, wow. And it paid $9,000. It might even have been like $7,500. And I asked the woman who offered, I was like, how can anybody live on that? And she was like, well, nobody lives on it. These were, the people who took those jobs had supplemental income. So because you have connections and you work down the road. But my father was, he actually, a couple of times where I was like, okay, I could make more money doing something that really was not going to lead anywhere I wanted to go. He was like, don't take that, take a job that has a future, or that has a track as a future, and figure out how to survive on less money in the meantime. And that, I think, was helpful. I think that attitude has gone missing in a lot of today's workforce, including, journalism and whatnot, where I think a lot of younger people now, even if, or maybe especially if they come from means, they expect to be getting paid a top salary right out the gate. And I don't think that works out in the long run. I think, that winnowing period is very important.
Job you like the best and the job you like the least?
God, let's see, the job I like the least. I'm not sure this qualifies, but when I was in grad school, like at every level of education, I guess both lower and higher, secondary and higher education, I worked to supplement whatever I was doing. I got scholarships for a master's program at Temple and a PhD program at Buffalo, but I still needed to work. And in Buffalo, I worked for this literary agency where you would read manuscripts and critique them and then offer an editing service. So it was kind of a scam. And that was a job that I disliked for two reasons. One, the owners of it assured me that, and they had like half a dozen books that had been published through them. So it was like, okay, they're not total scams, but it was mostly a scam. And I remember, I kept some of the write-ups I would do, and it'd be like your manuscript of a novel of an emergency room nurse who develops ESP is fascinating, but the plot needs work. We can help you with that type of thing. And it became like it was soul killing. It was like being Miss Lonely Hearts, but on a much, much lower and more horrible level of kind of indulging people or encouraging them to, continue doing something that had no way of going forward. That
aspiring writers with no hope are a sad, sad bunch.
Yeah, and and I include myself for the most part in that, but so I know what it's like, but it's like that was too much. And I got like 50 or $75 a manuscript, and yeah, just I couldn't do it anymore. And in a way that was it was definitely more repellent to me than, like working an overnight shift in a factory in the middle of nowhere and then driving home when the sun was coming up.
Mhm.
But the job I like the best really is, I've been at Reason since 1993. I started as an assistant editor, became, managing editor and then editor in chief of the print magazine, then of the video platform we launched in late 2007 and the website. And now I'm an editor at large. So like I've had many different jobs within Reason, but what I liked about Reason, it gave me a chance to develop, I think, intellectually and journalistically over time and to grow an audience. I realized I didn't want to stay in academia, partly because my politics, and I was in grad school in the late 80s and early 90s. My politics were definitely, getting more and more, untenable in the academy.
More and more
But
Reason
also,
magazine-ish.
yeah. Well, I wanted to, I wanted to write for a bigger audience, and Reason really allowed that. So, and I was
Yeah.
able. The person who hired me, Virginia Postrel, gave me a lot of first off, a lot of structure and a lot of guidance. Really helped my writing and reporting and thinking about things, but also an immense amount of encouragement and free space to kind of roam around and do things that traditionally Reason hadn't really written about. And then as I moved into a managerial role in a kind of oversight role, I was able to, create a magazine and pull together a group of people who at various points we've been, really had our finger on the pulse of things or what comes next. And I like that. That's been really great. I think a lot about. I have two adult children, a 30-year-old son and a 23-year-old son. And I think a lot about, the arc of things, like where, my grandparents escaped 1,000 years of serfdom and peasantry in Europe for something a little bit better. And then they eked out a living for their parents who had something that was a little bit better. And I have something that's a lot better than what my parents had. And I think about my kids and their generation and younger people today that, if one way of thinking about America is that you can come here and live a meaningful life, a life that where you get to express your deepest commitments and your ideas and who you are and what you believe in, and create a world that reflects that through your work and through who you live with and how you live. And I feel like we're doing a pretty good job of delivering on that as a country, as a culture, as an economy. I think a lot of the things that we fight about now, we're like, we're pretending as if we aren't fabulously wealthy, filled with lots of life options. And instead, we're arguing about different options people choose. But the big story is, that millennials and Gen Z have more meaningful choice than ever to live a life that expresses who they are. And a lot of that comes through work. And I'm not a Arbeit macht frei type guy. I'm not,
Let's hope not.
yeah, but the fact is like the option of being able to do something for a living that you really care about and that expresses who you are or what you believe in or how you want the world to be is not like trivial at all. That's like, that's a huge giant win. And I wish we could talk about that more. And it doesn't, mean we don't criticize all sorts of aspects of lives or the individual choices people make. But for God's sake, that's incredible, and
Yeah.
it's like, we should be kind of figuring out ways to talk about it more positively.
I don't find your optimism surprising because I've read you for many, many years,
Yeah.
and I know what you think about things. But I think you're more patriotic than I am. I got to say, Nick, you sounded
Yeah.
positively patriotic there for a second.
I love my country. I fear my government. But I love my country, and
I love my country, but I think we should start seeing other people.
As long as it's not like Hungary or Russia, maybe it's like, and I think we should be seeing a lot more people coming in. But I take, a couple of years ago, I took my sons to Ireland, to where my grandparents were from.
Mhm.
And Ireland is, from what I understand, Ireland is the only country in Europe that has fewer people now than it had in like 1800.
Yeah.
So, there's just a massive diaspora. My grandparents were relatively late in getting out, but when I saw what was there, and it's beautiful, and it was peaceful and all of this and all of that, but it was, you know, it was stultifying. And I take really seriously the courage they had to leave and to go to America, which was probably better, but you never know. And I take seriously what America offers to people, because none of my grandparents and really neither of my parents were able to live a fully realized life, and I feel like that's an inheritance worth not only celebrating but also kind of trying to make sure expands and maintains and includes more and more people.
When I first learned that there were more people of Irish ancestry living in the United States than in Ireland, I thought it was a really remarkable fact until someone
Yeah.
pointed out to me there are more people of Norwegian background in the United States than in Norway, and Swedish background in the United States than Sweden, and
Yeah.
it's true of Lithuania and a whole bunch of other
Yeah.
countries.
But I mean, the thing about it is really like, yeah, the fact that in Ireland and there are fewer people now than there were, in the beginning of the 19th century. That's pretty stunning, and it's
Yeah.
partly, it was partly death and, famine, but a lot of people leaving. So, and I mean, Ireland is a better country now. It took a long time for them to kind of shake off a particularly oppressive form, I think, of traditionalism and socialism. In the first whatever it was 60 years of independence from England.
Yeah.
But yeah, I am a patriot. I think America is great. I think it can be better.
And if you weren't doing what you're doing now, what do you think you would be doing? Do you have one of these Star Trek alternate timeline versions of your life where when you're 20 you decide to do something else and you're now a composer of classical music or something? Or
I've had a beard or mustache a couple of times, so I know what it's like to live in a Star Trek alternate universe. And those results were not good, but I probably would have gravitated into something having to do with academia. I was doing well, and my
You're Dr. Nick Gillespie, is that right?
Yes. Yeah, I have a
what was your dissertation about?
It was called, boy, I am blanking on the name, and I have a copy of it. It was called Qualified Authority in American Fiction, Participant Observers and Market Orders. It was a study of 19th and 20th century American fiction, taking seriously the idea that in a liberal order, that individuals have choices to make in all aspects of their lives, and that causes a lot of anxiety. And so in the 19th century, I looked at works by people like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Washington Irving and Lydia Maria Child, who was a very popular writer in the 19th century, but is not so well known now, and Edgar Allan Poe. And then in the 20th century, the good chapter was a reading of The Great Gatsby as a novel about immigration and the anxiety that induced in the kind of WASP establishment. And it reads against most interpretations of the book. And I'm happy it was, for a while anyway, it was, I wrote a version of that for Reason, an essay about the movie of The Great Gatsby from a few years ago. And it was like heavily quoted in the Wikipedia page.
Is this the DiCaprio or the Redford?
DiCaprio.
Okay.
Yeah, the Redford book, The Great Gatsby, I think, is a fantastic novel, and it's generally, it's read in the dumbest way possible as just a kind of love story. And the Redford version is particularly bad at that.
Great costumes, though.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we'd have Ralph Lauren or a lot of other things if it wasn't for the early 70s Great Gatsby.
So do you ever had any career ambitions that were outside the sort of writing, academic, intellectual world? Did you ever think maybe you would, start a business? Or do you say, I mean, given your age, you're just a few years older than I am, that
Yeah.
you really could have gone out to California when you were a young man and made yourself a billionaire? Or
Yeah, I don't. I have an immense amount of respect for entrepreneurs. In a lot of ways, the economist who resonates with me more and more as I get older is Joseph Schumpeter,
Hmm.
the great advocate for entrepreneurial activity and whatnot. But I am just not uh, very entrepreneurial myself. I mean, I like to, so I don't think I would have been very good in Hollywood or in Silicon Valley. And the stuff that I did at Reason, that's kind of interesting and like really kind of ushering and shepherding the video platform to where it's at now was good. And that was mostly, what I think I'm good at is bringing one sensibility into another area. And so, like, I wrote a lot about popular culture, applying kind of a libertarian analysis to it, both in terms of the way things get made, but also the way they get used by people. And that worked pretty well. And at Reason TV, or our video platform, basically at a time when everybody at news magazines were trying to figure out how to do video, I was like, let's do journalism rather than bad versions of cable TV,
Yeah,
panel shows and things like that. And that worked out pretty well. But
did, yeah.
yeah, I'm just not I don't have a head for business.
Well, that's all right. As we get ready to sort of wind down, what things have you learned from your jobs that have been important to you, like things that weren't obvious to you?
Um, I think the thing that has remained consistent is like really putting in effort, and showing up. Like it sounds ridiculous, but being to work on time, ready to work, and then putting in like a full time. And I'm a big fan of what Benjamin Franklin called a visible industry. It's good to let people see you work. Like, and people like this at every stage of your life, in school or at work or whatever, where they never want to be seen really working or putting their nose to
Trying
the
too hard.
grindstone. Yeah. And it's like, no, that's really not good, because first off, it's a lie, I think, almost always. And secondly, it's helpful, for people to see you doing that, including your supervisors and whatnot. But you learn more by doing. I think the other thing that I've learned is like to ask more questions, like when you don't understand what is being asked of you, to actually kind of ask, whoever is giving you a task, like, okay, what do you want? And like that can become, you know, annoying if you are like completely out of it. But in general, I feel like people are too, in all kinds of dimensions, people are too worried about looking as if they don't already know the thing that they're supposed to be learning how to do. And it's
Yeah.
like, and I don't, it's not feigning ignorance, it's just actual ignorance. When I was in grad school, before I started at Temple, where I was doing creative writing in English, I took a grad class at Rutgers in postmodern theory, or post-structural theory, as it was being called. And I'm a fan. I consider myself postmodernist in many important dimensions. But I remember asking the professor, like, or when people would say things, I would ask them could you explain that term? And like 9 times out of 10, they would start, and then they would realize they didn't know what they were talking about, or anybody else. And I wasn't doing it to be a dick or anything. It was just like, I'm really trying to understand. And like, that's like, it's really helpful when you honestly ask for more information that can help you become smarter or more productive or anything like that. I think a lot of people are worried about looking like stupid or not cool, and that leads to a lot of bad outcomes.
Franklin was a real performance artist about the
Yeah.
visible industry thing. You probably know this story, but when he had his print shop down on Market Street in Philadelphia, he would take a wheelbarrow full of
Yeah.
like paper and printing supplies in every morning so that the local city fathers could see
Yeah.
how hard young Ben Franklin worked. Now the other 60 wheelbarrows full of material were brought in
Yeah.
by his indentured
Yeah.
apprentices.
And he also, is a master of self-presentation, right? I mean, he's in that instance, but in everything else. And I mean, I'm always amazed that in the autobiography, he talks about the racket that he got, where he got a state contract to provide material to armed forces out in like what became Pittsburgh. I think it was like Fort Duquesne at the time or something. And the war ended before he got his stuff out there, so he just kept it and then resold it. I mean, he was not scrupulous in the way that we would normally think, public-private partnership should be working. When he talks about forming the junto, where, it was a secret society with 12 people, where the first order of business was getting all of those people to swear to secrecy and then direct more people to each other's businesses without telling them and create their own secret societies. I mean, Benjamin Franklin's a genuinely fascinating character, and one that we should always be studying, and kind of both critiquing but also emulating in very important ways.
Not the last semi-corrupt government contracting story to come out of Philadelphia.
No. And that's, have you ever read The Financier by Theodore Dreiser?
No, I have not read that.
It is, he's best known for Sister Carrie, but he wrote a trilogy of books that starts with a guy in, a local entrepreneur and government ripoff artist in Philadelphia, and it's fascinating. It's a great story of of how that kind of stuff happens from the early 20th century.
Good stuff. Well, Nick, I've appreciated the conversation. Anything you want to add in closing?
No, just if people are interested, I host a weekly podcast called The Reason Interview that you can find at reason.com and all over the place. And one of the things that I try to do is to talk to entrepreneurs and businessmen as much as kind of political figures or intellectuals, because I don't necessarily fetishize work or entrepreneurs, but like to me, one of the most amazing things about kind of broadly speaking capitalism or free enterprise is that it generates value. I mean, there's just stuff laying around all over the place, and it generates value out of stuff that is other people's detritus or that we can't see, the value in. And I find that fascinating. I mean, it's a form of alchemy, and it almost always, when it works, it just makes everybody better off. And, I wish as a society, I think we go through phases of really being appreciative of entrepreneurs or being really nasty towards them and trying to shut business down. I think, I think this is one of the worst elements of the Biden administration, is that at every level and at every turn, if there's a dial you can turn to kind of try and squeeze business down a little bit, or commerce or transactions among willing participants, the Biden administration is always like, how do we turn it from 6 to 2? It's never how do we turn it from 6 to 11 or something like that. And, I think that's really important, because work is not simply how we make a paycheck anymore, where it's not. I used to think a lot about Fred Flintstone. He would get paid at the, in the credit sequence of the Flintstones, the whistle blows, he slides off the dinosaur and then goes home and takes his family out to see a movie and get a slab of Bronto ribs and all of that. Now we live in a world where you can actually, the work you do expresses you. It's not just money in order to go and enjoy yourself. And like I wish we would go full throttle at that, and and discuss it more and lionize it more, and kind of make it easier for people to understand and appreciate.
Yeah, this is a whole other conversation. Maybe we can have some other time. But I think one of the real dividing lines in American culture is a kind of emotional and psychological dividing line between people. This is not a virtue thing, but between people who enjoy seeing other people's success and people who are bothered by it.
Yeah.
I think of the case of Elon Musk, who I don't think I would like Elon Musk very much. And God knows I have my criticisms of him as both as a businessman, as a general human being, and all the rest of it.
Right.
But it is pretty cool that someone would say, I'm going to start a car company from scratch and then make it happen and make a pretty good car.
And a rocket company, right? It's, I agree. And
the rocket company to me is almost less impressive in a way, in that there are a lot of car companies out there. And deciding to do that from scratch is a different kind of thing.
For me, the person where that is most clear, I know you and I are both friendly with John Mackey, the co-founder of Whole Foods, who He is somebody, he's got a new book out. I just interviewed him about it called The Whole Story. And it's a great business memoir and a personal kind of memoir or, story of kind of growing, through work and through his personal life. And there's a spiritual dimension to it. It's like really fascinating. But the way that somebody like him revolutionized the way we think about food and how we shop for food and what we find in the produce section where, it used to be, there would be a couple of mealy, there would be a red apple and a green apple and a purple eggplant. And now there's like so much choice that things have to have labels on them telling you what they are and whether or not you can eat them or how to prepare them. I love that. I mean, and I know a lot of people who are mad somehow that John Mackey has done well by making our life so much richer. And Jeff Bezos, obviously, Amazon bought Whole Foods a few years ago. I don't get it. I don't get the envy. I mean, I get the annoyance and frustration if people make a lot of money and then they start telling you that they are morally superior to you or that they, if they're rubbing it in. But like, for God's sake, when you think of all of the people who have made what the technology we are communicating through, I couldn't fucking come up with any of it. And this allows us to talk, but yet people get mad at the people who got rich by making everything better. That, again, it's not to be uncritical, but like, I just saw something. I'm sorry, you got me off on this because I saw I saw a YouTube video this morning from Adam Conover, the guy who had a good show called Adam Ruins Everything. Mm-hmm. But it was like, we need to limit like why billionaires should be illegal or something like that. And it's, like, what does that even mean? Like, there are two types of billionaires in the world, and there are people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. I don't think Mackey's a billionaire, but close enough, who make money by giving people stuff at a better price, cheaper, more easily than they ever thought of. And then there are people like Vladimir Putin or, Muammar Gaddafi or leaders of countries who just steal from people and then park it in Swiss bank accounts. And, go after those billionaires. That's bad billionaire stuff. But like, for the most part, Jeff Bezos has done nothing other than make my life a lot easier. And we should recognize that.
Yeah, I've got 4 itty bitty kids, and Amazon is an absolute lifesaver. So Jeff Bezos, peace be upon him. I am not sure that I would say I have the same taste as he does in many things in life, but he sure looks like he's having fun.
But that's what's great is you don't have to, because you can go to Amazon and, with very few limitations, like he can buy what he wants and you can buy what you want, and there'll be 10 versions of what you're looking for.
Yeah. Nick, thank you so much. I'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
That concludes our most recent episode of How the World Works. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Nick Gillespie as much as I did, and I think Nick did too. You can watch the video on YouTube if you are so inclined, and you can look for the link to that in the show notes. We'll be back next month with another interview.